Hi again and very welcome to the chapter about prophylaxis. Here we will have a look at how we can use prophylactic thinking in order to meet our opponent's ideas in the best possible way. For example, we will see how we can use overprotection in the sense that we protect weak spots in our camp, typically pawns, before they are actually attacked. We will see how we can withdraw pieces from exposed positions before they are attacked. We will have a look at prophylaxis in the attack, because sometimes when you're attacking, actually you can see that your opponent would like to do this and that, and we can prepare for that as well. We will have a look at how we can use our rooks in a mysterious way. We can put our rooks on a file which might be opened at some point. That's what I think Nimzowitsch called the mysterious rook. And we will also have a look at a similar king move, when you move your king in advance before it's actually checked by the opponent. But first, before we move into the concrete examples, I would like to show you a very simple example about how we can actually make a difference between restrictive and prophylactic measures. So this is what I wanted to show you. Let's see if I can remember this. Let's say we're playing with the black pieces. They play e4, and let's say we play the Sicilian here c5. White plays e3, the Lapin variation. We play knight f6, e5, knight e5, d4, c takes d4. This is all very well-known theory. Let's say white plays knight f3. Here we play d6, c takes d4, and e6, one of several ways in which we can meet the Lapin with the black pieces. Okay, let's say white plays a3, preparing to go bishop d3 without allowing knight b4. By the way, restriction here in action. We could play perhaps bishop e7. After bishop d3, we will castle. Let's say they castle as well. We will put our knight on d7. You will ask, why don't we put that knight on c6? Well, you will soon see what I have in mind. Let's say white plays here first rook e1, and we play b6. Okay, at this point, we're going to play bishop b7. We would like to play some kind of hedgehog setup here. Let's say white plays now bishop c2. So why do they retreat the bishop to c2? Well, the answer is rather obvious. They would like to install a battery here. White would like to play next turn queen d3. So what should we do about that with the black pieces? Well, if you would like to restrict, if you would like to avoid queen d3, not let them play the move that they would like to play, so to speak, what would you play then with black pieces here? You're right. You could play here bishop a6. Typical prophylactic move, you would say, but in my definition, this is a typical restrictive move, because you're not letting him play what he would like to play, queen d3. Now, I'm not saying that it's the best move in the position, but it's interesting, no? Because he will have to play something else. He can no longer stick to his supposed plan of queen d3. On the other hand, if you would like a more prophylactic way of meeting the threat of queen d3, you could actually let them play queen d3, but without the desired effect of, let's say, forcing us to weaken our kingside with g6 in view of the mating threat on h7. So how could you take prophylactic measures here? Exactly, we could play here rook e8, so that when white plays queen d3, we would then go knight f8, like overprotecting the pawn on h7. I mean, you could even play it, if white plays something else here, you could still play knight f8. If they play bishop d2, let's say, you could play knight f8. This would be a typical overprotecting measure, knight f8, protecting the pawn on h4 in advance. But okay, let's say he plays queen d3 and we play knight f8. So you can see the difference here. In this way, we actually let them play queen d3. But if we play instead bishop a6, we are not letting them play queen d3. So this would be the restrictive measures. And here, as you can see, rook e8, queen d3, we allow them to play queen d3, but not with the effect that they would like to weaken our kingside with g6, for example. We will play knight f8 instead. So typical prophylactic measure, in my opinion at least. All right, let's move on. Let's have a look at some examples on the topic of prophylactic thinking. Here in our very first example, we have a kind of hedgehog position. White has just played the move a4. This is actually an idea that we came across when we saw the game between Salov and Karpov. If you remember, Salov used this idea in order to put pressure on Black's camp, create weaknesses. That's how we came across this idea previously in the chapter about creating weaknesses, I think. Yeah, using the pawn majority in order to create a weakness on the queen side. So here white again has played a4, and what do you think we should do about that? Well, we could of course prevent it, restriction, play a5, but that would have the big downside that now white could use the square on b5 at some moment. Not now because the pawn is hanging, but maybe they can prepare it somehow. Maybe they can put their queen on c2 and later on play knight b5. That would be a problem for black. It's true that they also have the c5 square, but okay. Usually when the knight comes to b5, there is troubles coming up also with the d6 pawn, so probably it's better not to weaken ourselves. It's too drastic here to play a5, and also white is not forced to play right now knight b5. They can play it perhaps a little later. They can have it in the pocket, so to speak. If we play a5, maybe they can play queen e2, put a rook on d1 and so on, and this move they will have it in the pocket. On the other hand, you might think about the move knight c5. This is a very reasonable move, but still probably white could just stick to their plan here, play a5. Now we can take the pawn on e4. Unfortunately, then the pawn on b6 will also fall off, and probably this is very dangerous for black. After knight takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4. Probably what white should do here is not to take with a bishop on b6, but with a pawn. So what's going on here? Well, white is about to play knight a5. This looks really dangerous for black. In the game, something completely different happened, because in this game between Sulskis with the white pieces and Govstein playing black, Govstein played simply rook b8. This is a very clever prophylactic move. We allow them to play a5. White duly played a5 in the game. And after b takes a5, knight takes a5, it's very easy to see what Govstein had in mind. He simply retreated the bishop to a8, which is clearly the best square for the bishop here, because in this way we are still putting pressure on the pawn on e4, and of course we don't allow them to play something like knight c6. And the rook on its part, it's happy on b8, it's working on the semi-open b file. It's true that white has a better pawn structure here. It cannot be denied that his pawn is weak, but okay, I would say under the circumstances black is fine here. Knight b3 was played in the game, and black offered the exchange, the repetition of moves, but if they didn't want to repeat, they could have played something like queen c8 instead. Anyway, bishop b7 was played in the game, perhaps to see if white would repeat again, but white didn't repeat. They played 92, castles, b4. This makes a lot of sense. Try to work on the queen side. Maybe the knight would like to go back again, who knows. However, it was black to play it. And here, Govstein did the same thing as Kasparov did in that game. If you remember, we saw this game between Hübner and Kasparov on the topic of dynamics. That's what happened here also. d5, the typical dynamic counter-strike in the hedgehog structure. Now we're aiming at that pawn on b4. So white played c takes d5, and after bishop takes b4, knight a4, e takes d5, e5. We already talked about this. When the knight is in the air, the best place usually is in the center. Here, Govstein played knight e4 and had a very active game. Summing up what we have seen here, white was about to play a5. Black didn't want to weaken their pawn structure by playing a5 themselves. Instead, they relied on this typical prophylactic measure, rook b8, so that after a5, they would be ready to take on a5. White is now allowed to achieve their plan of planting a knight on a5, but with less than the desired effect, because now we can play bishop a8 and everything is in order here. Black has complete control. Okay, let's see an example of how we can use prophylactic thinking in the attack, which is, I would say, not two words which you hear that often together, right? Attack and prophylaxis. It sounds like the opposite, but nothing could be like that. That's not true. We can use a lot of prophylactic thinking when we're attacking. If you don't believe me, please check this example. Judith Polgar playing with the white pieces and playing black is Smirin. Here, as you can see, white has sacrificed the exchange in order to reach a very promising attacking position. There are not many defending pieces on black's king side. Only the bishop is there, kind of lonely. The queen is in the bad place because, yeah, the black king is stuck also. And it's easy to think that white is on the verge of winning already. Just play bishop d3, put the rook on h1 and so on, and we will soon win this game. However, if we look carefully at the position, and I should also tell you that black's last move was actually queen e8. If we look carefully, we can see that black has something very specific in mind here. So why do you think black played queen e8? What's the point of putting the queen there? You're right. What black is preparing to do here is to play f5, which is a weakening move. But at the same time, the point of f5 is that they are offering the exchange of queens. So white wouldn't be able to play e takes f6 en passant because the queen would be hanging. And since you only have en passant once, I mean, for each pawn, so to speak, white would have to retreat the queen and it wouldn't be the same kind of attacking panorama. So if we play bishop d3 just to give an example about what I'm talking about here, yeah, definitely black would play f5. We don't have time to play e takes f6 because we're hanging the queen. And on the other hand, if we retreat the queen now, let's say queen h3, black would play something like queen g6, try to bring the queen to g4 and swap queens, which would be very, very useful for black here, of course. They're exchanged up and white is trying to mate them on the king side. So it's clear that when playing queen e8, black would like very much to play f5, and we cannot really prevent this move. So what did white play in the game? What did Judith Polgar play? She played the prophylactic retreat queen h3. And now, as you can see, it's a different story, because if they play here f5, I mean, we could take en passant. It's possible to take en passant in order to clear some space for our attack. But even stronger here would be the move bishop c4. Bishop c4 check, and here, as you can see, the bishop is aiming at the square on e6, and we also have rook h1 in the pocket just in case. Let's say they play something like king h8, we could play here bishop e6, attacking the rook and the pawn at the same time. Also the knight is about to join. Yeah, this looks very, very promising for white. So if we look at this from a very technical point of view, we can see that white doesn't know yet whether they would like to play bishop d3 or bishop c4. Both moves are possible, but they still don't have enough information to know exactly where to commit the bishop at this very moment. So they don't want to play bishop c4 because maybe the bishop would be better off on d3, and I don't know, maybe black has a move like knight takes e5 and try to take that knight with the rook, that bishop with the rook. So a very clever move also from a flexibility point of view. Queen h3. We're waiting for information from black in order to see if we should post our bishop on d3 or on c4. In the game, Smirin played here the move h6, and here Polgar decided that, yeah, the bishop should definitely be on d3. Now, there is no problem with f5 anymore. As you can see, we can just take that pawn. You can see a very big difference here if we compare this position to the initial position. If we had played here bishop d3, like we were saying, f5 would come and black would be able to swap queens thanks to the white queen hanging. Not so after queen h3, h6, bishop d3. Now no longer f5 is possible. So in the game, Smirin went for a counterattack here, knight b4. Let's see how Polgar reacted to this. Well, first bishop e4, keeping the attacking bishop, and black played here the move, by the way, please notice mate is in there, so black played here the move e6. So what to do with white here? The pawn is hanging, maybe there might be some other attacking idea on the king side, the pawn storm, so on. There are many choices here for white. However, what Judith Polgar played was clearly the strongest one. She played here f5. Very, very nice. Time is money in these attacking positions with kings on opposite flanks. What's happening here is that white is going to play f6. And since the queen is badly placed here on e8, it's not really easy for them to defend against this plan. In the game, Smirin continues with the counterattack. Now the game gets very, very interesting. f6. Currently, white is a whole rook down, but okay, you can see that there is a very strong threat here, queen g4 or perhaps queen g3. Black played in the game queen b5, bringing more pieces to the counterattack. Polgar also explains that if black had played here queen a4 instead, well, white would just manage to take and put the king on b2. After knight takes c3, inviting white to take in order to bring in the rook, well, Polgar had prepared a nice rook move here. The move rook d4. Nice intermediate move in the defense. In this way, we get ready to take next turn, and then we can hide the king on d2. Very nice. You have to think about attack, but also about defense in this kind of position. So, nice balance here, I would say, between attack and defense. Queen b5 was played in the game, and here white simply played queen g3. Queen g3, and black resigned at this moment because their counterattack is not really working here. If rook takes e2, bishop takes e2, knight takes a2, king d2, queen b4, king e2, you can see that white is escaping from the checks. The king can later on come this way, and yeah, no way they can continue with the checks here. So black resigned after the move queen g3. I think very interesting way in which Polgar analyzed this position. She noticed that f5 was in the air and she couldn't really prevent it in a clever way, so she just withdraw her queen here, and in this way she was ready to meet the move f5 by giving check on c4. On the other hand, in the game, when black played instead the move h6, she preferred to post the bishop on d3, creating the threat of queen f5. So I would say that the idea of prophylaxis goes a little with flexibility also. You first commit one piece, and in this case the queen, and you stay flexible with another piece. All right, let's see a case from the endgame where this topic can also come up. Let's see here a game between Kasparov and Kramnik. This is, as you can see, Berlin, Roy Lopez. This is easy to see from these pawns, double pawns on C in the C file, and the fact that the black king is not on the king side. So here it's black to play, and if we use prophylactic thinking, we can actually find black's best move here without much difficulty. How should we use prophylactic thinking? Well, we should think in the first place about what our opponent would like to play if it was their move. So looking carefully here, well, if it was white to play, what would they like to play? Well, definitely rook d7 must be a candidate move for white, attacking the pawn on f7. Okay, we can play, of course, king c8, preventing that. That would be restriction, but okay, then white could play rook e8, and maybe when we go back, we lose time. They can take, they will bring in the other rook. Yeah, actually, this would be a disaster for black, right? If we play something like this, we will just end up losing the game, I think. So, not a good idea to restrict this idea of rook d7, prevent it. It's better to allow white to carry it out, but without the desired effect. So, how can we do that? Well, Kramnik decided that it was time to protect the pawn on f7, even though it's not attacked at this point. How can that be done? Well, by the simple move rook f8. Very, very nice. You can only play this kind of move if you actually look into what your opponent would like to do in the same position. So here, if rook d7, yeah, we're ready to go king c8. In the game instead, Kasparov tried rook e4, and now Kramnik resorted to king c8. Now that the rook is already active. Well, you might claim it's not very active on f8, but okay, it will get active later on. Here, white played in the game f4. Kasparov explained that h4 was better, but still it would be more or less drawish here. He is explaining that what black should play at some moment is knight e4, giving up the pawn on c5 in order to take the pawn on f6, and that would be draw in the air. In the game instead, he played here with white pieces f4, black took on f4, and now that the king is covering the d7 square, as you can see, finally freedom for this rook. So Kramnik hurried to play here rook e8, and probably already black is slightly better here, slightly more active. White still has to take care of the pawn on f6, and also there are some ideas like rook e2 coming up. In the game, white played bishop c3. Kasparov said that rook d2 was better, but okay, these are small differences. Important for us to understand the main topic here, the prophylactic thinking. Anyway, rook e2, rook f2, rook e4, rook h3, and here Kramnik played the move a5. Usually this makes a lot of sense when you play the Berlin, because you're then able to play a4, and if they play a4, well, the pawn on b3 will become a bit weak. So I have seen this move on many occasions. It seems to be very clever in this structure. Anyway, main point here is that we cannot really prevent our opponent's threat of rook d7. It would be horrible to play king c8 due to the check on e8, as we already analyzed. So we have to take prophylactic measures instead. So what's the problem with rook d7? Well, the main problem is that our pawn on f7 is attacked. How can we defend it? Using the rook on a8, which anyway needs to get into the battle. So rook f8, of course, prophylactic thinking, overprotection of the pawn on f7, and after rook e4, now finally Kramnik played king c8 and f4 taking, and then black was fine. So interesting way of thinking, not very difficult, but I think very, very useful. I think it was actually Nimzowitsch who started with this kind of thinking, overprotection. He used it a lot. He would often overprotect the pawn on e5, I think, in the advanced French or something like that. But okay, I think it can be used in many different ways. This is a good example. The pawn on f7 is weak. Let's protect it in advance. All right, let's speak a little about the king. The king is a piece which has a lot of necessity of defense, of prophylactic measures. It's a very exposed piece. We had a look at some ideas about how to safeguard our king in the opening, in the early middle game, in the chapter about the king. And here I would just like to show you one example of how we can use this thinking also in later stages of the game. Here in this game between Lausbu Hansen with white pieces and Sergei Tivyakov playing black, we have a typical structure with hanging pawns. As you can see, the pawns on d4 and c4, and very often white likes to attack in this structure. I think I showed you one of my games in this structure. Yeah, the example about swapping defensive pieces, right? In the chapter about using exchanges in order to realize an attack in order to help your attack. I played knight e4, swapping off the knight on f6. Maybe you remember. Anyway, what happens here is basically the same thing. White has lined up their bishops on these diagonals, very well placed for an attack. And black is already a bit nervous here because white has a concrete idea. White would like very much to install the battery by playing queen d3. Then what white would like to play is d5. Why is that? Well, the point of d5, there are 2 points of d5. One of them is that after e takes d5, white would be able to take on f6, eliminating the defender on f6, and later on there would be mating ideas with queen h7. On the other hand, after queen d3 and d5, if white is able to launch these 2 moves, well, if black takes back on d5, also you can see that the e-file is opened. So the black king could not escape anymore. So I don't know, maybe we should look at this in some concrete variation. Let's say we play something like knight g4, white will play queen d3. Now there is the threat of giving check on h7, and if black insists with winning material, well, that would come huge problems here in the way for black after knight takes e3, f takes e3, queen g5, queen h7 check is coming up, but first we can play d5, and it's only after e takes d5, queen h7 and as you can see there is mate in the air. After king f8, what white should do is make sure that the black king won't run away. How can that be done? Of course, using the knight. Very nice, knight f5. Unfortunate for black, this pawn prevents the mate on g2, so nothing really black can do about queen h8 next turn. So this happens if black doesn't really think about what white is up to here, I was saying. But if we think about what our opponent has in mind, we can try to prepare for that threat. And that's what happened in the game. Tivyakov played a very nice king move, king f8. So we're kind of moving the king in advance before it's actually attacked or given check. And that will give us some more flexibility next turn. Here in the game, Hansen played queen d3, which is still very logical because white still has the idea of playing d5, take, and bring the queen to h7. And at this point, Tivyakov played the move queen h4. I understand the idea. Now, the bishop might go to f4 at some point. Knight g4 might actually create a mating threat for black, because then, as you can see, the pawn is attacked and white would not be able to play queen h7 simply because it's not check anymore. But most probably, if we take into account that white would like to play d5 and later on the queen will arrive at h7 after swapping on f6, maybe there is a better square for the queen. And I think that square is g5. I think this would have been a very clever move for black, because after d5, pawn takes, bishop takes, black would take here with the pawn. And then we will always be ready to bring the queen to defend the king if necessary. So it's good to have the queen controlling these squares in the event of white playing something like queen h7, for example. We're happy to have the queen here. Maybe we can take, and maybe later on we can run away with our king. On the other hand, in the game, Tivyakov played here queen h4, and I'm not completely convinced about what happened here, because Hansen played h3, but it was interesting to see what would have occurred after d5. If white continues in the same fashion here, e takes d5, bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and here white plays queen h7, I think maybe this would have been slightly complex for black. Knight f5 is also coming up, not now because there is a threat of mate, but maybe later on. So I don't know if how is this position to be analyzed. It's complex. No, rook takes, pawn takes maybe, and yeah, white is threatening to give check on h8 and so on. So maybe if black wanted to avoid this, it would have been even better to play the move queen g5 here. I mean, instead of queen h4, put the queen straight away on h5. On g5, sorry. Anyway, let's see the game. Queen h4, h3 was playing the game. White avoids knight g4, but here black is ready to get more active. Bishop f4, and after rook e1, queen g5. Now the queen steps on this square. This is a much safer square for the queen. I mean, in the sense that it's helping the king in a better way. White played the move bishop a2. Probably they're about to play d5. You could expect a move like rook d8 here. However, in the game, Tivyakov resorted to a very nice dynamic move. We spoke about dynamic in the chapter about dynamics, and here we have a typical case. Black played here. Well, maybe you can see it. How can you use your pawns in order to create weaknesses in the white camp? You got it, b5. This is actually a thematical idea when you're facing the hanging pawns, because after playing b5 you want them to play c5, because in that case the pawn on d4 will become blocked. You can later on block it with the bishop, for example. On the other hand, if white here takes on b5, well, we could just take back and white would be forced to swap pieces because, as you can see, the rook is hanging. So they're not very happy now because they end up with a isolated queen's pawn also. This would not be a good structural difference, let's say, structural change in the position for white. So in the game, what white did was very clever. They played d5 instead. So now they are also playing in a dynamic way. They want to get a better pawn structure, at least better than the one they get in the other variation. So d5 is very clever here. Now, if black takes on d5, white could perhaps take on b5. And as you can see now, black is somehow obstructed by their own pawn on d5. Yeah, this is a typical pattern actually in some openings. You sack the pawn. In the Benoni, for example, you can do this with white. You play first e5, and then when they take, then you play e5. Well, later on, we can have a look at that. Anyway, d5, b takes e4 was played in the game. Now white took on f6. We have some trades coming up here. Black took back with a pawn, actually, because in this case, the knight is still a bit tied. It cannot go to h5, which would be the case if we took with the queen. So here, white played bishop takes e4, and finally black decided that it's time to move into the endgame, which I think it was a very wise decision because there are still some threats coming up here. So bishop takes d5 was very clever. Just swap everything. Bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes d5, and e takes d5. We have reached an endgame where black has slightly bad pawn structure, but they're a pawn up, right? And also the bishop is strong, so black has no real troubles, and the game was later drawn. Summing up, what we have here is a typical case of using the king in a prophylactic way. White was about to play queen d3 followed by d5 with very dangerous threats against the black king. Black couldn't really see a way to avoid this. No way they can prevent queen d3 and also d5. I think it's impossible to actually physically prevent it. So what they did, they took prophylactic measures, moving the king in advance. And in this way, the plan of bringing the queen to h7 was not that dangerous anymore. All right, let's have a look at the mysterious rook now. Another idea or concept which I think comes from Nimzowitz's thinking from the very famous book, My System. Here we have a game between Susan Polgar with the white pieces and Uwe Bunch playing with the black pieces. It's a typical Queen's Gambit exchange variation where white has played in this nice Botvinnik style with f3. They would like to play e4 one day, but this is not the moment because, as you can see, black would take and the pawn on d4 is hanging. So speaking about the d4 pawn, as you can see, it would be great to give it some more support, this pawn on d4. And also we should notice that maybe black would like to play at some point c5 in order to liberate their position a little. If white takes, well, black will take with the pawn and there will be pressure against the pawn on e3. So how can we cope with these difficulties with the white pieces? Well, already back in Botvinnik's days, the answer was clear. White should put the rook on d1. Rook a1, if you don't know a little more about this position, you won't understand this move. Why on earth are they putting the rook here? Because it's a closed file. Why? What is the rook doing there? However, it has to do with these two things that I'm saying. One of them, white would like to play e4 very soon. And the other one, c5 might come up. And if c5 comes up, definitely it will make sense to have the rook on the d file because we will put pressure sooner or later. On some occasion, in some situation, we don't know exactly how. That's what prophylactics is also about. We don't always know exactly how the things will turn out in the end, but it will definitely make sense to have our rook on that file. So rook a1, very clever move here. If now black plays c5, just for the record here, tactical speaking, we can see the idea behind rook a1 because actually white would win a pawn here. White could take on f6 first in order to deflect the bishop from the defense of the c5 pawn. Then we can take on c5. And when black plays rook takes e3, thanks to the rook on d1, we can take the pawn on d5 here by playing knight takes d5. Since black cannot take due to the trick bishop takes h7. So here it's clear that the move rook a1 has helped us a lot. In the game instead, after rook a1, Burns played knight g6 and white retreats this bishop. Again, black maybe would have liked to play c5, but it's out of the question. If they play it this time, white would win a pawn. Can you see how white nets a pawn here? Exactly, the same topic. We will get this pawn in the end. First, we will take on c5. Sorry, first we will take on g6. Okay, I think it works the other way around also, but anyway. Now we take on c5, and after knight takes c5, we can play Bishop takes e5, we can play knight takes d5. As you can see, this little tactical idea, pick up the bishop next turn with the queen, definitely wouldn't work if the rook was not there. In that case, black would just take with the queen, but that's not possible here because we have the rook also in the battle. So nice tactical little trick here. Black is unable to play c5. For that reason, they played bishop d6 instead. And here, speaking about pawn majorities, this is actually very well connected to the example that we saw with Gligoric playing with white pieces against Benko. If you remember, in a similar structure, Gligoric hurried to play e4 and later on e5. That's exactly what Susan Polgar did here as well. e4 came up. Usually in this kind of structure, if you can get away with e4, play it, play it. It doesn't matter if you lose the bishop pair or something. It usually has a huge impact on the battle. So e4, d takes e4, f takes e4. Of course, we should keep the pawns together and keep the f file open the f file for our rook. Knight g4, as you can see, black has counterplay, but this pawn should advance just like in the game of Gligoric. e5 came up here. If black takes on f2, that would be a bad idea because the queen would take back and f7 is now under an attack. So in the game, bishop c7 was played instead. How can white benefit from the space gained by e4, e5? Well, it turns out that now, since the f file is open and there is no real counterplay in the center anymore, white is ready to attack this pawn on f7. So how can we attack that pawn in the best possible way? You're completely right. Bishop c4, that's a nice move. Very, very good diagonal for the bishop. The bishop is grateful to the pawns, which helped it to clear this space, this diagonal, which was not available. I mean, if we go back to the beginning. Yeah, as you can see, this bishop did not have any chance of occupying this diagonal, but thanks to this e4 break, white is now able to put a bishop on that very nice diagonal where there is no opposing bishop, by the way. Anyway, here rook e7 was played. You could say prophylaxis. We are protecting the pawn on f7, which is definitely a weak spot in black's camp. King h1. Now, by playing this move, also you could say prophylaxis. We're getting out of the g1 a7 diagonal with our king, which is never in vain. Typical pattern in the Sicilian, open Sicilian, for example, to play a move like that, king h1. Now bishop g1 might come up also, attacking the knight, so black hurries to take on f2. We already know the right way to recapture, of course, bringing the queen to the attack, queen d7. And here, if you allow me to connect this with our chapter about space, here you can clearly see that when white was able to play e4 or later on e5, they gained space with the pawns, and that space can be used by the fellow pieces. That's exactly what happened here. I'm pretty sure you can see Susan Polgar's next move here, right? That's correct. Knight e4 is a very nice move here. The knight joins the party. It might go to g5. Maybe it can go to c5 also. We don't know yet. We only know that this is a very nice square for the knight. A perfect central control by white. They control the whole center, and that's something which will help them to attack also. Once you have the center under control, it becomes a bit easier to attack. Rook f8 played in the game. Queen f3. The queen is improving. It would like to go to h5 perhaps, attacking the pawn on h7 as well. Queen e8, queen h5, king h8. How can we bring more pieces to the attack? Well, by using the third rank. We spoke about this in the chapter about the rook. Here we have a typical rook lift. Rook d3 was played, so that after h6, rook h3. Well, I was going to say rook h3, but actually there is no reason to play it anymore, right? Because they played h6. Rook df3, sorry. Now we have a lot of pressure on the pawn on f7. This is starting to look very, very difficult for black here. Yeah, they're kind of desperate in this position, and they played here the move knight takes e5. This doesn't work, but it was hard to save them anyway. I think one concrete threat here is actually to play queen takes g6, and if f takes g6, rook takes f8. Not easy for black to defend against that. This rook is protecting the f7 square, but it cannot really protect its fellow rook. So very, very difficult for black. They tried in the game knight takes e5, sacrifice, d takes f5, rook takes e5. Okay, it's understandable. They are trying to get back the piece by this double attack, but okay, a lot of tactics in this position, as you can suspect, with the king on h8. So white found a neat little tactic here. Rook takes f7. Very nice. We're now threatening rook takes f8 check, so there is no time for rook takes h5. In the game, they tried rook takes f7, but simply queen takes f7. Some nice tactics in the end. This is a very, very nice way of finishing this game, because like they say, chess is the tragedy of one tempo. After queen takes f7, queen takes f7, rook takes e4. You might think that black is close to saving themselves here, but that's not the case, because we have rook f8 check, king h7, and finally bishop d3. Very, very nice play from from Sousa Polgar, sorry. In this game, as you can see, white would like to play e4. They would also like to take measures against black's idea of c5. How can we accomplish both things with one single move? By playing rook ad1, a so-called mysterious rook, maybe not that mysterious perhaps anymore. We put the rook on the closed d file because we know that very often very soon there will be tension in the center. White will play e4 or black will play c5, and in that case the rook will be very useful on d1. Let's have a look at one more example, which has to do with the idea of retreating a piece before it's attacked. It's a very common technique, and I would like to show you only one example on this idea. Here we have a game with white pieces, Reinaldo Vera, and playing black, Pia Kamling. Here, as you can see, we have a typical Benoni structure. Kamling has just played here rook ab8. It's very evident what she has in mind. She would like to play b5, of course, one of the most typical ideas in the Benoni structure. So, can we prevent that somehow? Can you see a way in which we can prevent b5? Well, I can't see it either. I think it's impossible, because if we put our queen on, let's say, e2, it wouldn't make sense. Black already has 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces controlling b5, so they would just play b5 anyway. We would actually help them, because now our bishop is getting into a bad place, and yeah, they will attack it. So it would be silly to play here queen e2. So if you cannot prevent something, try to take prophylactic measures. Try to find a way in which you let them play what they would like to play, but without the desired effect. And that's what happened here, because Vera knew that he would have to move the bishop anyway, right? So why not move it straight away? And where should we move that bishop? Well, if you look carefully, you can see that it would be great to put it somewhere where it doesn't interfere with any other piece. And where would that be? You're right, bishop f1. Very, very nice move. Impossible to play this move if you don't understand what your opponent is up to. So what is going on here from a tactical point of view is that if black plays b5 now, we can take, and here, thanks to the flexibility gained by retreating the bishop in advance, now white can play a move which they couldn't play in the first place, if you see what I mean. Now white could play the move, you got it, rook h7. Very, very nice. In this way, white puts pressure on black. Now we're speaking tactical pressure, because there is a concrete threat of knight takes b5, rook takes b5, bishop takes b5. Black cannot take with the knight because the knight is pinned, so they take with the queen, and white picks up the rook on, the knight on c7. If they try to play here black b4 in order to prevent this, well, white could just stick to the same plan, knight b5. Very nice. They would have a lot of pressure here in this position. It's difficult here to play with the black pieces. Let's say they defend the knight on c7. Well, white could step up the pressure here by means of the very nice move e5. Here you can see that it's good to have the bishop on f1. It's not on d3 or e2, where it would interfere with white's control in the center. Here tactics works wonders for white. If black takes on e5, we would be ready to play here d6. Very, very nice coordination among the white pieces. So bishop f1 was played in the game. Since you saw this idea of rook a7, I just wanted to make it clear that, I mean, you cannot play rook a7 here, right? It's an illegal move, but the idea as such is very strong. So you can only play rook a7 after black having played b5, but when black plays b5, our bishop will be in the air. That explains why it's so necessary, so nice to play here bishop f1 first. So b5 would simply fail tactically to this resource, rook a7. Very, very nice. Yeah, by the way, if you take, you might ask yourself, if I then take with the knight to avoid the pin, well, then I could take the pawn on a6, right? So I would be just a pawn up here. So in the game, Kamling had to do something else. And actually, she also played the prophylactic move here. She played the move rook ec8. Why do I say prophylactic? Because if black is about to play b5, and we saw this variation with rook a7, there was a tactical idea of knight takes b5 and take with the bishop on b5. In that case, black would take with the queen on b5, and the rook would protect the knight on c7 in the end. If you didn't understand me 100%, you will soon see what I refer to. White played here the move g3, which makes a lot of sense. Maybe one day the bishop will be redirected to the other diagonal, the h3 c8 diagonal. We don't know yet. This is what flexibility is about. We will see what black has in mind. Maybe they will move their queen. In that case, definitely we could consider the move bishop h3. And now black played b7, b5, sorry. Here we can see clearly what I was speaking about, the idea of rook c8, because after a takes b5, a takes b5, rook a7, black was ready to play here b4. So now there is no need knight b5 anymore, sorry, because black would just take back, and here, thanks to black's prophylactic move rook ec8, now the knight is not attacked anymore. So that's how prophylaxis works. In the game, for that reason, white played knight a4 instead. This is a good move because now, as you can see, the move e5 is coming up. And white is trying to undermine black's pawn chain so that the pawn on c5 becomes a weakness. And it's not so easy for black to avoid that. They would have preferred to have the queen somewhere else so that the knight could go to d7, but that's not possible right now. Queen d8, and of course, you know what follows here. Also, I didn't even mention this, but white has the bishop pair, so if the position is opened, it will probably favor them. Having said that, it's easy to see white's next move in the game, right? Of course, time to play e5. By the way, one of the most important ideas in the Benoni as such, I would say, for white is to push e5. If you play the Benoni with black, try to avoid this. Knight f takes d5 was played in the game. If d takes e5, you can bet that white will play here d6, pawns doing favors to the minor pieces. Next turn, we will play here bishop c4 with very nice pressure on the a2 g8 diagonal. So for that reason, in the game, instead, after the move e5, black played knight f takes d5, but white continued in the same policy, bishop c4, putting more pressure on black. After d takes e5, queen b3. Already, black was under a lot of pressure, but they found a nice move here, rook a8, trying to swap that strong rook on a7. Rook takes a8, rook takes a8, rook d1. It appears as if black will now lose a piece. However, Kamling has noticed that she has this nice counter-attacking move, queen e8, targeting the knight on a4. But anyway, white has no reason to trade, of course, their bishop for this knight, so to speak. They are very much happy to keep the pieces on the board and put more pressure. So knight takes e5, of course, much stronger. Now material is balanced, but white has a lot of pressure. Knight b6 was played in the game. Bishop d3. We have the threat of bishop takes g6. The pawn is pinned. So black played here king h7. And finally, white was able to get back that pawn. Queen takes b4. And I think, oh, they were actually pawn down then. Okay, now it's equal, but still, white is much better here. You can see the bishop pair and also the fact that white has a passed pawn, which might or should become useful later on in the game. So very nice game, very nice play here, prophylactic thinking by Vera. He noticed that b5 was in the air, no way he can actually prevent b5. What to do? Well, prophylactic measure. Put the bishop somewhere, retreat it before it's attacked. Which is the best place? Definitely f1. And I was saying from a purely tactical point of view, if b5 now, thanks to the flexibility gained by bishop f1, we can play this very nice move, rook a7. All right, let's have a very quick look at what we have been studying here in this chapter about prophylaxis. First, we saw how Goffstein noticed that a5 was coming up, so he played a clever prophylactic move, rook b8, in order to safeguard his bishop on a8. It was not really possible to prevent a5, it was better to let white carry it out, but to secure our pieces in the best possible way. Then we saw Judith Polgar in this very nice attacking position. She wanted to attack. Her first thought was definitely to play bishop d3, but she noticed that f5 was in the air. What to do? We cannot really prevent f5 in a good way, so let's just retreat the queen. And only after that we will play bishop d3 or perhaps bishop c4, depending on black's play. We saw how Kramnik against Kasparov noticed that the move rook d7 was in the air. It didn't make sense to prevent it, so let's safeguard, let's overprotect our weakest spot, the pawn on f7, by means of rook f8. Then we had a look at Tivyakov's game, where Tivyakov noticed that queen d3 and d5 was coming up. What to do with the king? We cannot really prevent white's plan, okay, but we can move our king to a safer place. That's what happened in the game, king f8. We had a look at Susan Polgar playing with the white pieces. She was very eager to play e4, but it was not tactically working, and also c5 might come up. How can we address these problems with one single move by playing rook ad1, the mysterious, or maybe no longer that mysterious, rook move. Finally, we saw Vera using the idea of retreating the bishop in advance. No way they can prevent b5, so it's better just to retreat the bishop and let black carry out their plan. Alright, thanks for watching and see you in the next chapter, which will be about a very interesting topic of provocation.